This video is all about the steering column, ignition barrel and indicator stalks in an old 1975 107 SL. Now the first thing to mention is that if your indicator stalk has stopped working, either it doesn't stay down like this one or it doesn't click back up when you turn a corner, you can remove the indicator stalk without having to remove the steering column. I've done a whole video on that previously for the more modern indicator stalks, but the principle is exactly the same for the older style indicator stalks. Basically, you unplug them and they thread through the steering column here, and there's just a couple of screws to undo here and the horn wires. As I say, I have done a complete video on that previously. Similarly, if you just want to remove the ignition barrel for some reason, you do not need to remove the entire steering column. If you do need to or want to remove the steering column, there are two bolts here, and to access those bolts you're going to need to take the instrument cluster out. You're going to need to take the ignition barrel off. Secondly, you've got 4 bolts down at the bottom here to undo. You've got a bolt here to undo, and once you've undone that bolt, this whole fitting here should slide up and will reveal a fitting like this. You'll have to undo that Allen bolt. When you come to slide the steering column out, bear in mind that this bolt has to come all the way out. If you just loosen it and expect to be able to pull that off, you will be there all day. It won't work because there's a groove in there that this bolt basically sits across. Another tip I would mention is when you slide this up, you may find it easier to take the accelerator pedal off. On our car it's actually removed anyway, but this here can, even when you've removed the pedal, this here plate can get stuck behind the metal rod on which the accelerator pedal sits, and you'll be pulling and pulling and pulling this, not realizing that this is actually jammed behind the pedal, and that's why it's not coming off. It should slot in and out quite freely, provided that is not jammed behind the accelerator pedal. Now, I mentioned these screws later in the video, but you do not need to take those bolts out. If you do take those bolts out, there is a very good chance that these little metal plates here, they're basically like square nuts that recess into those holes, there's a very good chance that will fall off down the steering column and you'll never see it again. So do not take those 4 Allen bolts out unless you particularly want to separate this whole steering rod from the actual casing. If you have a later 107 SL with this style of indicator stalk, in my experience, repairing them is not easy to do and is not really an option, and you're better off just getting a brand new one. They are freely available, and one of the cheapest places to get them is actually Euro in America, and I'll leave you the cost and the part number at the end of the video to show where you can get a new indicator stalk for your later R107 SL. On the older style indicator stalks, this one here that came off the car, the problem is the indicator stalk wasn't staying up or down. It may actually be possible to repair them. I mean, it may be worthwhile repairing it because getting hold of these can be quite difficult. And in this particular case, the only thing that's wrong with it is that spring there should be attached there, but that piece of metal is broken, so you could possibly just either JB weld something in there, or I don't know, drill a hole and put a metal bar or something like that, tiny screw in there for that screw to hook round, and you'd probably find that this works fine once you've done that. I think in this particular case I'll take the whole steering column off, because I noticed there's quite a few bits missing off here, like there's no rubber gasket here, there's not a rubber gasket at the end, and seeing as we're in the process of redoing all of this front footwell anyway, we might as well take this off and put one in there that's slightly better condition. Here's what you need to do if you want to take out the indicator stalk. And the first thing you need to do is take out these rubber gaskets. They should just pull straight out. This one here was loose anyway, so it's just a matter of undoing these two screws here. Once you undo that last screw there, this will just come loose like this. You can see it's just threaded through this piece of the steering column. Once you've undone those two top screws, to get this out, you next need to undo these two slotted screws. I believe these are the wires for the horn, so don't just go pulling this out without undoing those. Remember which way round they go. Don't lose this little metal cap here. Maybe different on your car, but this has got a little L-shaped cap that just presses that piece down on there.
When you take that little cap off, just remember that the L-shaped is on the outside.
In theory, you should just be able to wiggle this through. We'll see if I can do that. There we go. Now, in order to remove this steering column from the SL, I believe you need to remove the ignition barrel. So I'm just going to quickly show you how to do that. The first thing to bear in mind is you can't remove the ignition barrel unless you have the keys for the car, because the ignition barrel has this little button here, and that button only presses in when you've got the keys and the ignition turned all the way. So for example, if we put this in like so, you will see that that button, spring-loaded button, is in there like that. That spring-loaded button gives you a little bit of movement in order to adjust the position of the ignition barrel relative to the hole in the dashboard so that your ignition barrel is dead centered, but it will not allow you to pull this out. There should also be a collar around here that you tighten up with a bolt, so that once you've got it in the perfect position, you tighten that bolt up, it pinches that tight. And to get the ignition out, you'll need to loosen that bolt, otherwise this will be pinched in there tight. Once you've got the keys in the ignition and you're able to push that button in, you should be able to pull the ignition barrel out, like so. Now, to get to these two bolts here, which hold the steering column on, you have to take the cluster out. And the cluster is just a push fit in there, held in with a rubber band around the end of it. On this particular car, there's just three things you need to disconnect. One is the main loom, this is the clock here, and then this plug here. Those bolts came out no problem. We used a 13mm socket to get those out, although they may actually be a 14mm. Don't lose the washer. Once you've loosened those two bolts, you can see that there's some movement in the whole steering column. To get that ignition barrel out, I've just dropped this down and twisted it so that the ignition barrel is now facing up that way, and the bit we need to press in is just there where my finger is, just here. So we need to somehow get the keys in there and just push that button in, and we should be able to pull that ignition barrel out. It is not a 5-minute job getting that out. Even when you've got the little button, it still takes an enormous amount of wiggling, and I've put a little bit of WD-40 down there to help it on its way. I think we've just about got it now. Whoa, finally we got that ignition barrel out. Whew. Once you've removed the ignition barrel from the steering column, to actually remove the steering column from the car, ideally you're supposed to be able to slide this bit up like so and reveal that Allen bolt there. Undo that Allen bolt and this steering column should slide off that fitting. Now, they haven't done that with this one that we bought on eBay, and I wonder if that's because getting that fitting off there is easier said than done. But in the absence of that, I imagine you'd have to somehow separate this from the steering box under the car. This is a 6mm bolt at the end, and my advice would be to make sure that you thoroughly clean it as well as you possibly can, so that when you try and undo that bolt, the Allen key goes all the way in, because this bolt here, for example, is rusted solid in there, and once you round that off, it'll be extremely difficult to get that bolt out. So we're going to give it a go in the car. Let's hope it's in better condition than that.
Okay, so I've pulled this sheath back here to reveal that bolt, and all I need to do now is try and undo it. I would say that this bolt has been undone before because it is coming undone way too easily.
There we go. We finally got that piece out there. Now the piece we bought on eBay is very slightly different. It's got that line down there. Can't see that being a problem, but it seems to be in much better condition. All I need to do now is get that fitting there off, and I should just be able to slide this straight in and put the car back together. I'm going to try and get this undone here with an impact driver rather than an Allen key, because the actual knocking effect of an impact driver may just knock it loose. We'll soon find out. There you go. It's so easy to round that or bend the Allen key, but the impact driver, actually the knocking effect knocks that rust loose. And there we go. Just be able to notice that end plate on the piece we bought from eBay is actually bent, whereas, and it may be purposely bent to fit the contour of the car that this came off, I'm not sure, but this piece here isn't bent, and once again they may have unbent it because they put new panels in or new metal in. Anyway, we're going to take the piece off the car and put it on the piece we bought from eBay, and in order to do that, all you have to do is just slide off this end rubber cap and that will slide straight off. It is worth mentioning that this outer collar here on this car anyway is actually brazed or welded onto the collar, so don't try and force this off or spin it round because it's actually attached. It's easy to make mistakes when you're taking these cars to bits if you don't know what you're doing. These screws in here simply hold this outer plate to the metal steering column casing. You do not need to take those off to get the indicator out or anything else. You only ever need to take those off if you plan to take this out of the casing. Now, as it so happens, those 4 screws are missing from the piece that we bought, so once again we're going to use the impact wrench to whiz those out and swap them into the part that we bought from eBay. Got those 4 screws out. This steering column will slide all the way out of the metal casing, and then there's this plastic bushing on the end that just slides off. It's keyed, so it only goes on one way. Just before we put everything back together, we're just going to put grease on all the fittings. We've sanded off all the rust, and we'll put grease on here and also in the inside of this plastic bushing and rubber bushing here. Also an idea to just check that this fits in smoothly, which it does. I've put a little bit of grease in there as well, just cleaned all the rust off there. We'll put some oil over there, stop it rusting in the future. Now we're ready to put this back. We've got all the rust and put grease on there. This all fits in really easily, so I'm actually going to attach the indicator stalk first. It's just easier to wire these things in. When you come to put this in, it helps sometimes to get a screwdriver just to stop the plug snagging on the inside of there. So I would stress you do not need to do this with the steering column off the car. You can do this in situ. It's just slightly easier. It's really tempting to over tighten these screws when you put them in, but don't do that because it's very easy to strip the threads. After you've finished tightening all the nuts down there, next thing to do is to slide the ignition barrel in. You need the keys in to get that little button in, and then with the steering column in this position tilted, you can get to that nut there to tighten. Once you've got that centered, you need to drop those 2 bolts in there and tighten them up, and that will pull the steering column up. And then it's just a matter of connecting the plug back on there. It is keyed, so it only fits on one way, and then putting the instrument cluster back in. Took the whole day to do that job, to change that steering column, but I'm pleased the way everything went. We now have a working indicator that stays down and up as it should and works as it should. While I was down there, I noticed there were a few rusty things associated with this brake booster here, so I think maybe in the next video we'll take this out, derust it and paint it, and just clean up some of the things under that dash that you can't see but that are a little bit rusty. I've mentioned these guys before and I'm sure I'll mention them again. apindustries.com. If you go to the catalogue and type in 450 SL starting at 1973, you will get an extensive list of available SL parts. Here's the turn signal switch here. And what you do is you just copy either the Euro part number there or the part number above. These guys just deal with wholesale, not with retail, and then you whiz over to Rock Auto, paste that number in, and it'll give you the price. You go to the rockauto.com website, just type in that number, 0055 454 124, and there you have the Euro part, £40.42. It's not expensive, but just before you get too excited, bear in mind there is some postage and possibly customs associated with that, but Rock Auto do ship to the UK without any problem. If you live in the UK, it's always worth checking out the SL shop for parts. They have that same part down there for £47.83. We were quite lucky to find a left-hand drive old style turn signal from these guys. I think they're in auto magnetic parts. I think they're in Lithuania. Here we go, Lithuania. Not cheap, £76, but as I say, pretty lucky to find one of those in such good condition.